In this tutorial series, we will look at creating a platform game from scratch. This is part 1, where we will configure the basic managers and characters required for the platform game. All Platformer Pro games require a Platformer Pro game manager. Typically, the best way to create this component is to create it as a prefab, which we'll then copy into each of our scenes. So let's create an empty game object and call it Game Manager. We'll then add the Platformer Pro Game Manager component. There are some optional components that we can add. For example, if we wish to use persistence, a level manager is required. Let's click the Create Level Manager button, which will create a child called Level Manager with a level manager element. Let's call our level 01. Let's take this game manager and turn it into a prefab. We'll create a folder called prefabs to hold our prefabs. Let's create a very simple level before we create our character. We're going to use a 2D tile map. Expand the grid, go to the tile map component, and let's add a 2D collider for the tile map. For now, we'll use the tile palette. It's included with Platformer Pro. Let's paint some tiles. Let's keep it simple for now. The next step is to create our character. Although you can quick start the creation of a character by using one of the characters from the existing samples, we're going to create the character from scratch to help us understand the various components that make up Platformer Pro. So let's create an empty game object and then an empty child, which we'll use to hold the sprites. Let's add a sprite renderer and select a basic sprite. We'll rename the top level object character. And then we'll add the main character component called character. You'll notice that we have many validation errors here. Let's address them one by one. So we have to have a ground movement. This is the movement that controls what the character does on the ground. You can have more than one ground movement, but we'll start with one. Let's create another empty child called movements, and then another child under that, and we'll call it ground movement. We can now add a ground movement component. There are two ways to do this. If we click Add Component and type in ground movement, we'll see that there's many options. You can pick from amongst them, or you can add this component at the top level called ground movement, and that'll give you a drop-down selector which you can use to choose your movement. Let's go with a basic digital movement, which means the character only can move with 3 speeds: stopped, left and right. This is the simplest of all ground movements. The only setting is the speed. We'll still have a warning because we don't have an air movement. Let's follow the same process, this time calling the object air movement. For this one, let's use the standard physics movement. In the air, typically the physics movements look better than the digital ones. We have a number of settings to control how hard we jump and the speed we can move and change directions within the air. We'll leave the defaults for the moment, but we'll go back to these. We still haven't set up the colliders for our character. Let's navigate to the scene view and click the Edit Feet button. This box, or these two handles, show us where the character's feet are. Let's move this in a bit to better reflect our character. We only have 2 colliders at the moment. Generally, it's recommended that you have at least 3 colliders, and if you're going to use slopes, even 5 colliders will likely behave better. So we can add colliders by clicking this Add Collider button. Let's just go with 5. While we're updating the colliders, let's do also the sides of the character and the head of the character. If we click the Edit Sides button, we'll see we can change the sides of the character. Like the feet colliders, we probably want more than the 2 here. You'll notice that with the side colliders, it's actually possible to create odd shapes rather than a square. It's worth noting that for most characters, even if they do have some protrusions, it's better just to create a square-shaped collider. The odd-shaped colliders are best only for characters that have a very unorthodox shape, maybe a horse, for example. You'll notice there's a little checkbox here which says reflect changes to both sides. So it's not required that the sides look the same. We can move to any shape we want. However, we're going to click Align in X and also Space Evenly to give us a very simple box shape. That will do for a starting point. We may need to tweak this as we go. Finally, we can do the head. Let's move the head down. We'll add at least 1 collider in the middle. And we can align them. And then this gives us the basic colliders that make up our character. Now it's worth noting, if we press this Debug Colliders button, we can actually see where each of the collisions is being checked. Each collision effectively represents a raycast. So if, for example, you had a platform that was smaller than this spacing between the 2 head colliders, the character would be able to jump upwards through that platform. In that case, you could add more head colliders. There is a very small performance cost associated with these colliders, but even on low-end mobiles, having 20 or 30 colliders is not an issue. Again, for now, this basic shape should do us. We may need to tweak a little bit as we progress. We still have one warning here. We haven't got an input in the scene. There's no way for the character to get input. Let's amend our Game Manager object. We'll create an input. There's actually a fairly complex input system behind Platformer Pro. with a number of options for supporting multiple controllers, configurable controllers, integrating with other packages such as Rewired or InControl. But for now, we're just going to use the most common input, which is the standard input. The standard input can support both keyboard and joystick or game controller. And it allows you to set up defaults, and these defaults can be reconfigured. You can also load settings from a file. What we're going to do is turn off the controller and just leave enable keyboard. And we can see here we've got right arrow, left arrow, up arrow, down arrow, Z for jump, X for run, P for pause, and we'll create one action button. We'll use C. Again, we can change these. One thing we want to do when we change a default is just hit this clear preferences button. Because what happens with Platformer Pro, when you start the game, the current preferences are loaded from player prefs. This allows you to configure input in the game, and then when the game is restarted, that same input is there. However, it's worth noting that these defaults will only be used if the preferences are clear. Let's apply this change to our prefab. We go back to our character object and we see we've got no errors here. That means we've probably got all of our basic configuration in place. There is a warning that we don't have a character health. It's not actually required that your character has health. Without a character health, the character cannot be killed. For now, we'll leave it. We can easily add it later. Let's save our scene. Let's play our scene. See what happens. Let's see if we can move our character. So we're able to move left and right. We're able to jump. And that's about all our character can do at this point. Obviously the jump is a bit floaty. But before we tweak that, let's add some animations. Firstly, address the warning. So the game manager allows you to load between multiple characters or choose between multiple characters. In order to do that, it needs to know where the character is. Usually the character would be a prefab, but for our first sample work, we'll select character in scene and drag our character over to there. We'll give the character an ID. Let's call it Pink Alien. So the character, when it loads, will be respawned at the last respawn point that was enabled. If there's no enabled respawn point, the character will be respawned at the default respawn point. Although the game will work without a point, it's better to put one in there. So if we go to our brushes, we'll see there's already a respawn point brush available. Click to the scene view. So let's start the character over here. We need to configure this respawn point before we play. So we'll see this prefab here. There's two things we need to configure. First, we need to give it a name. So I'm just going to call it level 01 start. The reason we put the level in the name is so that we can have respawn points that respawn you in another level. This enables you to do things like teleports or doors that move between scenes. And in this case, we're going to tick the is default starting point box, which means it will be the default spawn point. So if there's no spawn point set, you will spawn here. This respawn point is already configured such that when you get within a range of 1, then it will trigger the respawn point. It's using whatever persistence is configured in the game manager. And when you do get to that respawn point, it will switch the sprite from the current sprite, which is this flag down, to the flag up. Now for a default starting point, this probably doesn't make sense because we probably always want the flag to be up. So let's just set this to none. And change the sprite to a sprite that's already up. In fact, because this is the default starting point, why don't we use a green flag? Let's save our scene and press play. We'll see now that we start at the green flag. We'll notice our sprites probably need a little bit of work in terms of the ordering because the character is behind the flag. Let's fix that and then go on to our animation. So there's already a sprite layer called character. Let's just use that. Similarly for the tile maps, the sprite layer, let's use the main geometry. The flag itself is in main geometry by default as part of the prefab, and it's actually put in position 1. So it will be in front of most geometry, but it will be behind the character layer. Let's start animating our character. There are many ways to animate characters in Platformer Pro. It can support basic sprite animations, more complex sprite animations, 3D animations, third-party animation providers, as well as the legacy animation system. There's a lot of options. The basic concepts are covered in the documentation. The key is that there's a component called a bridge, which listens to the animation events that are sent by the character and then acts on those events to create animation for the character. The simplest bridge is called the Mechanim 2D bridge. It simply uses the play action from Mechanim to play a specific state in the Mechanim animation controller. Let's add that component. We'll add an animator and an animation controller. Let's create one from scratch so you can see the process of animating your character. Create a folder called animation, and inside that we'll create a new animator controller called Pink Alien Face Controller. Assign that to our alien sprite, and if we open the animator window, we'll see we have an empty Mechanim animation tree. So let's create a state called idle. The state names match the states in the file called animation state. There are many different states sent by many different movements, and also some placeholder states like custom 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, which you can use for your own animations. Note that the state doesn't imply a certain animation. It's just a piece of information sent from the bridge, or sent to the bridge, and then the bridge can interpret how that is used by the controller. In the case of the 2D bridge, the state name must match the state name in Mechanim. So we will need a state name for idle, for walk. Jump is made up of 3 parts. Jump, when the character leaves the ground. Airborne, when the character is moving upwards. And falling when the character is moving downwards. Let's organize this a little better. For each of these states, we need to assign an animation. We won't create the animations again. Let's just find the existing animations. So we don't have a separate pink alien airborne, but we can just use the same jump animation. If your character has more complex animations, these 3 steps allow you to break it up. Similarly, I think falling is just the jump as well for the pink alien. Let's save that and hit play. We'll see that our character can now walk and jump. I have made an error because I called the state fall, and we see a warning. The state fall is not in the animator. Let's go back and find our falling state and rename it to fall. Hit save. Now it looked like the walk animation was a little bit fast, so let's just change the speed of the animation there. Now the character is not changing direction, or changing the facing direction. This is because we make a distinction between an animation and the facing direction. To fix this, let's find our alien sprite and add a new component called a direction facer. There are several types of direction facers. For example, one that rotates a 3D model, or one that faces in the direction that you aim with your mouse or keyboard. But we want the simplest direction facer called Unity Sprite Direction Facer. Basically, all this does is flips the transform on the sprite. So the scale is 1 or -1, which, as you can see, turns the character around. So I think our character is mostly okay. However, his jump seems to move a bit fast in the horizontal direction. So let's change some of the movement variables. Let's go to the air movement. We'll reduce the maximum speed to match the walk speed of 5. And we'll probably slightly reduce the acceleration to match that. Let's give that a try. The character can still change direction in the air reasonably fast, but their jump is now the same speed as their walk. Let's set up our camera. There's a component called Platformer Pro Standard Camera, which enables the camera to follow the character with various settings. It also allows camera zones to be defined so that the camera won't move beyond the boundaries of a level. Let's add this camera, and for now, let's say that we won't move on the y-axis, but we will move on the x-axis, and we'll start moving once the character is about 2 units from the center of the screen, and we'll accelerate at about, let's say, 5 units per second. We hit play now. We'll see that the camera follows the character. However, it's a little bit jerky. I think the change we want to make is letting the camera offset a bit more and reducing that acceleration. Maybe not quite so much. There is also an option for hard follow. That means the character always stays exactly in the center of the screen. Bit too fast. I think I'm happy with 3 and 2.5. That's it for part 1. In part 2, we'll look at some more interesting platform geometry, as well as adding health to our character and causing damage to our character.